said. Many soldiers after the Gaza events, they spoke out about their experiences in Gaza. So this is what they said. Soldier, there was nothing there. Ghost towns, except for some livestock, nothing moved. Soldier, most of the time it was boring. There were not really too many events. Soldier, I did not see one single Arab the whole time we were there. Soldier, everyone was disappointed about not engaging anyone. Soldier, usually we did not see a living soul, except for our soldiers, of course, not a soul. Soldier, go ahead and ask soldiers how often they encountered combatants in Gaza. Nothing, no one. Soldier, there was supposed to be a tiny resistance force upon entry, but there just wasn't. There was no one. Now that comes from a publication called Breaking the Silence, a compendium of soldier testimonies after what happened in Gaza. And that's one side of the story. There was nobody there. There were no battles. There were no enemies in the field. So that's half, as I said. The other half gives you a full picture. And it's worth it for you to look at it for yourself. If you get home, to just enter under Google, Breaking the Silence, and you bring up the document, and then you enter under the search function, enter the word insane. And if you enter the word insane, you'll see there are 7 times it appears in that document. Now the soldiers were interviewed separately, but they all kept saying the same thing. Namely, that Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Israel used insane amounts of firepower in Gaza. Insane, insane, insane. No enemy in the field, no resistance, no battles, but Israel is resorting to insane amounts of firepower. One soldier said, "This was firepower such as I had never known before. There were blasts all the time. The earth was constantly shaking." Another soldier said, "On the ground you hear these thunderous blasts all day long. I mean, not just tank shelling, which was a tune we'd long gotten used to, but blasts that actually rocked the outpost, to the extent that some of us were ordered out of the house we were quartered in for fear it would collapse. They were shooting and firing into the horizon, but the houses that they had commandeered in Gaza were shaking from their foundations, even though the firing was into the distance." So what happened in Gaza? Actually, some of the soldiers came up with quite illuminating metaphors. One said, "It felt like hunting season had begun. Sometimes it reminded me of a PlayStation computer game." Another said, "You feel like a child playing around with a magnifying glass, burning up ends." Now, when I was a kid, I remember, and I used to take that magnifying glass, focus the rays of the sun, and incinerate ants in an anthill. And I can't say I'm proud of it, but I had, even at that age, enough lucidity of mind not to imagine I was engaged in a war. And that's what was happening in Gaza. It was like a child playing with a magnifying glass, burning up ants. About 1,300 to 1,400 Palestinians were killed, up to as many as 4/5 were civilians. about 350 children were killed. The total, the estimates are 353 to 358 children were killed. Total Israeli casualties came to about 10 combatants killed, not about, we know exactly. 10 combatants were killed. Half of those 10 were killed due to friendly fire, Israelis accidentally killing each other. And 3 civilians were killed. So it was a ratio of about 100 to 1. 100 Palestinians were killed for each Israeli killed, and of the civilians, it was about 400 Israeli civilians killed for every Palestinian that was killed. 400 Palestinians killed for every Israeli killed. I would want to just make a side comment there. There was much criticism of a lot of the human rights reports, including the Goldstone reports, which it was alleged they were disproportionate, the reports, in their allocation of space to criticism of Israel and criticism of the Palestinians. And in fact, they were disproportionate, but the disproportionality goes in the opposite direction than what was claimed against these reports. If you take the Goldstone report, to which I'll return presently, it devoted about 1/5, between about 1/10, I'm trying to estimate now, I would say it devoted about 10% of the report to what happened in Israel, and about 90% to what happened to Palestinians. So it's a ratio of about 9 to 1, roughly speaking. But if you look at the actual numbers, say, for example, numbers killed, the ratio is about 400 to 1. Civilians killed. Total killed about 100 to 1. Or you take something like damage done to infrastructure. About 6,000 Palestinian homes were ravaged during those days in Gaza. In the case of Israel, Amnesty International wrote that one house was almost completely destroyed. So the ratio was roughly about 6,000 to 1 when it came to houses. As I said, about 100 to 1 when it came to total casualties, 400 to 1 when it came to civilians. So Goldstone devoted about 10% of his report to Israel. He gave it much more space than the objective data actually warranted. And that was true of all the reports. In the case of Human Rights Watch, time doesn't allow me to go into detail. Human Rights Watch put out 5 reports. Of those 5 reports, 2 of the 5, 40%, were devoted to criticizing the Palestinians. One because of the Palestinian attacks on Israel, and a second devoted to Hamas treatment of dissenters during the Gaza attack, basically attacks on Fatah people. So they gave over 40% of their total report coverage of the Gaza to criticism of Hamas. If you look at the proportion again, it's way over what the objective data would have warranted. Well, what happened apart from the killing? Many things were said about the attacks in Gaza. First of all, it was said that Hamas was using ambulances to ferry militants and weaponry. All the human rights reports investigate that claim. I should point out that probably no other occasion in the history of the conflict produced so many human rights reports as the case of the attack on Gaza. There were probably about 12 to 15 major reports that were put out. As I said, 5 by Human Rights Watch, 2 by Amnesty International, 2 major human rights missions, the Dugard mission and the Goldstone mission. Then there were reports by Physicians for Human Rights in Israel, several major reports by Palestinian human rights organizations. So it's been very extensively studied, and the reports are quite detailed. They all investigate the claim that Hamas used ambulances to ferry material, ammunition, weaponry, and militants. They all reached the same conclusion. There was no evidence whatsoever, even though Israel repeatedly targeted Palestinian ambulances. There's no evidence whatsoever that any of the ambulances were misused. And in fact, one of the interesting, among many interesting facts in the Goldstone report, the Israeli national, I have some friends here from Israel. Can you just raise your hand? Okay. Magen David, what's its official title?
It's like the paramedics.
Ambulances. Ambulances. They testified to Goldstone themselves. Magen David testified. I guess it's called Adom, A-D-O-M, Adom Magen David. Right. They testified there is no evidence whatsoever that those ambulances were misused by Hamas. As many of you know, Israel also targeted hospitals systematically in Gaza. It dropped white phosphorus on several of the hospitals. White phosphorus reaches a temperature of 800 degrees centigrade, 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. And they dropped white phosphorus in Al-Quds Hospital and the second hospital, and many of the hospitals were attacked. The grounds Israel gave was that the hospitals were being used as refuge for Hamas militants. That charge, too, was exhaustively investigated by all the human rights organizations, and all the human rights organizations reached the same conclusion. There's no evidence whatsoever that those hospitals were being misused by Hamas militants. I would also want to point out that the Israelis themselves presented next to no evidence to support their claims. So if you take, for example, the question of the ambulances, Israel put out a large report defending its actions in Gaza. And I read the report with considerable care. The only evidence they were able to present on the question of the ambulances is they quoted one ambulance driver as stating that Hamas attempted to commandeer his ambulance, but was unsuccessful. And so by the Israeli admission, there was not a single case of an ambulance having been misused. On the question of the hospitals, the only evidence that Israel presented that the hospitals were misused, they claimed that one Palestinian detainee who they interrogated had acknowledged that there were Hamas officials in Shifa Hospital. But as Goldstone pointed out in his report, all of the Palestinian detainees were brutally tortured during the events in Gaza. Then there's the question of the targeting of the mosques in Gaza. Israel claimed the mosques were being used to store weapons. Israel only provided evidence, well, it claims to be evidence, for December 31st and January 1st, where they said that there were secondary explosions in some of the mosques after they targeted them, which basically means that you drop some missile or bomb on the mosque, and then after it explodes, there are secondary explosions, which supposedly indicates that there were weapons hidden there. But after January 1st, Israel itself stopped making the claim that there were secondary explosions. So if you look at their press releases from January 2nd onwards, which